Joining us on the panel for the next hour, we have Admiral Lord West, former Security Minister under Gordon Brown, former Chief of Defence Intelligence and First Sea Lord. Sir Alan Duncan, the former Foreign Office Minister and Conservative MP. He's got a paperback of his book out. We'll find out what it's called in the thick of it, isn't it? Thank goodness I remembered in time. Jude Kelly, multi-award-winning theatre director and founding director of the WOW Foundation. That is a great name for an organisation. And the annual Women of the World Festival. We'll find out more about the WOW Foundation in just a few minutes. And Grace Blakeley, economist and author. Her last book is called The Corona Crash, and she's in the middle of writing a new one, so we're very glad that she's got the time to join us tonight. 0345 6060 973. That's the number you need. We've only got one space on the switchboard, but keep trying if you can't get through initially. And you can watch, of course, on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Marjorie in St John's Wood. Marjorie, hi, what would you like to ask?
Well, I can't understand why everybody's so frightened of the idea of Putin's going to use nuclear power. I mean, all the major countries have got this, and we're quite capable of returning it. I mean, we've got nuclear submarines that could take St Petersburg out in a matter of moments. So why are we all so frightened of his threats?
Why are we so frightened of Vladimir Putin? Alan Duncan.
Because he's not talking about nuclear power. He's talking about the nuclear bomb. And that is altogether a very different matter. So when he's thinking about deploying the most destructive weapon the world has ever known, then that would be a problem. And what one has to hope is that this maniac, and he is a maniac, A, doesn't mean it, and B, if he does, that the apparatus around him will be far more sensible and somehow protect and ensure the world against a reckless, destructive, heinous action such as pushing the nuclear button.
It was interesting when he announced this on Russian television yesterday, the face of his, I can't remember his exact title, the Chief of Defence Staff, I think.
And Defence Minister.
His face looked like stone, didn't it? He did not look impressed.
Well, I found that encouraging because, I mean, I think that one of the great principles we have to remember is we've got nothing against the Russian people. It's the way they're led. And it's who they're being led by, if leadership is the right word, dominated by. And that one has to hope that when it really comes to the crunch, the people around him will be far more human than him and will never do something so ridiculous. And I think probably what this whole conflict could turn on is the mood in the street of the Russian people, if ever they're allowed to express a view without being arrested, and that means there has to be a lot of them. And hence, therefore, the mood of the people immediately around Putin in the Kremlin, because however sycophantic they are, however rich they've become by sucking up to him, there comes a point where some basic humanity needs to step in, and they need to realise that this man is a complete monster and a very, very dangerous one who's really bringing a lot of death and destruction, not just to Ukraine, but also to his own young, exhausted soldiers and their families.
Grace Blakeley.
Sorry.
Why are we so afraid of Putin, and why are we so afraid of this threat around nuclear war? Well, I mean, I think we have to hope that actually this threat that Putin is making is somewhat overblown for many of the reasons that Alan has just laid out. When we're thinking about international relations and when we're thinking about relations between countries in the run-up to war, we usually analyse this from the perspective of assuming that actors are behaving rationally. And a lot of what Putin has done doesn't appear to be rational. And I think we have to take a step back here and think about what is motivating Putin on a personal level, on a political level. And a huge amount of that is it is profitable for him to stoke up nationalist fervour within Russia, just as it has been throughout much of the rest of the world. Nationalist leaders all over the world today are stoking up nationalist fervour in response to long-term economic stagnation that is dividing people amongst themselves. And because a significant chunk of the Russian population does blame the West for what is going on, Putin thinks that he can profit from making these threats. And up to now, he has gambled that he would be able to do so, perhaps while the attention of countries like the US and the UK is focused predominantly on China. What we've seen so far is actually the West has been willing to go much further, particularly when it comes to the use of central bank sanctions, which is something that we haven't really seen as yet in the history of kind of, international economic sanctions. And that is really hurting. It's particularly hurting the Russian people, actually, more than it's hurting the billionaires, many of whose wealth is stashed here in London.
You're an economist. Do you think that these sanctions will work?
Well, again, we have to look at Putin's personal and political incentives when answering that question. There is no reason to believe that Putin cares or has to care about the situation faced by the majority of the Russian population. They're the ones that are going to be harmed by these sanctions. And as long as he's insulated from any backlash, he's not going to bother with that. The thing we have to really focus on, where does Putin get his support? There are about 500 oligarchs surrounding him who collectively have about the same wealth as the rest of the Russian population combined. Much of that wealth is stashed in London. We've known about this for many, many years. It's about £65 billion worth of Russian money that's come into the UK via offshore secrecy jurisdictions over the last 10 years. And very little has been done about that. In fact, a parliamentary report from 2008 suggested that our politicians were turning a blind eye, even after Crimea, even after Georgia, even after these poisonings. Sorry, I know you're going to tell me not to bang my hands on the desk. We've had this conversation so many times before.
This is a perennial problem on this desk, but well done. Alan?
Well, I think it is extremely worrying. There's no doubt about it. The Russian doctrine for use of nuclear weapons is rather different from ours, and they are willing to use nuclear weapons at what they call the tactical level. I've always had huge difficulty with this. I think a nuclear bomb on Warsaw isn't a tactical weapon, it's a strategic one as far as Warsaw goes. But they have used it as part of their combined arms fighting. I think this threat, and he's now made it twice, was aimed at the West. I think it's very worrying. I met Putin in the early 2000s, and I always thought of him as a pretty unpleasant chap, but he was an unreconstructed KGB officer with certain views about Russia, which he loved the idea of Mother Russia.
How did you come to meet him?
I'm sorry?
How did you come to meet him?
I met him at a couple of sort of events, and the last one was actually where he was giving medals to my sailors for rescuing his sailors who had stuck at the bottom of the ocean. And he, as I say, he loves Mother Russia, but he actually doesn't really like Russians. That's the sort of feeling one has, that because the way he treats them is not good. This is a very high risk, this is. Because what he says is that if there's a conventional fight against NATO, and we have to make sure we've got sufficient forces in the Eastern European NATO countries, if it's not going right for him, he will, as he calls it, de-escalate by firing a nuclear weapon. He doesn't know what NATO's doctrine is, or he should do, his generals do. If someone fires a nuclear weapon at you, you fire one back. That makes these statements very, very dangerous. And I have no doubt, having known him then, whilst I say I didn't particularly like him, he at least seemed to be rational. I think when you saw those things he did speaking to his nation, it gave you the feeling he's slightly unbalanced now. And an unbalanced man in that position is worrying. The chief of his defence and the chief of his strategic missile forces sitting in that picture, if you looked at their faces, you could see them thinking, crikey. And what I'd like to think is, when he says come to a new readiness, that maybe they're not doing quite what he says, because they can seem like that, but you can get to a position where, and that's why I think he's particularly mentioned the submarine part of his force, where he said they have 500 missiles where I could wipe out the West. I mean, this is extraordinary talk, but he's got those in a way he could have more immediate control of.
And I presume it's exactly the same as if Boris Johnson or Joe Biden wanted to press the red button, as the saying goes. That doesn't actually activate a nuclear weapon. There are procedures that have to be gone through, and at any point in that procedure,
certainly I only know I was in the nuclear firing chain for the UK, and the Prime Minister, although he is the one who decides, the Prime Minister can't wake up in the morning. Boris can't wake up and say, oh, stuff it, there's all this stuff about parties is too much, we're going to end the world, because it would not happen.
That's a relief to us all.
It's a relief.
And you worked with him.
I'd rather party.
Jude Kelly.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with you that we should be actually worried, because we weren't worried enough that an invasion was really going to happen. Everybody said it won't happen. A lot of people said it won't happen. I mean, you can see from the queues at all the railway stations that the Ukrainians themselves didn't actually think an invasion would happen. And it does seem as if Putin might have gone rogue. And you look at the natural journey of most despots, they do go a bit mad. And I remember, Mary Robinson, when I was interviewing her a while ago about climate change, she said we should be very worried about climate change, but we should also be worried about nuclear, because we've sort of turned our attention away from nuclear weapons, feeling as if, it'll never happen because, that's a bad war for everyone. But when you've got somebody who might have lost their marbles somewhat, and they're talking about nuclear weapons and deployment, I think that is really frightening. So I don't know, when, was it Marjorie said, surely it'll be fine because, we can outgun them. You can't outgun on a nuclear level in that way. You can only have destruction on all sides. So Mary Robinson again made a statement today on behalf of the elders saying, we've got to focus on this. We can't kind of bypass it and say, well, he'll never use it, because I don't think that's true. So although I agree, Grace, that, all the things that we need to do about sanctions, all the things we need to do about Russian oligarchs, they're all true. I think we should have done sanctions much sooner, because it's, those don't take, you go and get the Russian people.
Well, before the invasion?
Yeah.
Well, there had been sanctions in place. Of
No, because that would have been seen as provocative, and I think that would have been very unwise, and you do need a pretext for sanctions. But I think the concern I sense we all have is what will be the actions and mentality of this man if he's got his back to the wall in a bunker facing defeat for this pet project. And that's when it gets worrying.
I just come in. What you said was fascinating, because many weeks ago, in the House of Lords, I said that the greatest danger to survival of the human race was a nuclear Armageddon, a thermonuclear war, and not actually climate change. And the wonderful response from Baroness Goldie was, the government feels it would be very unfortunate if there was a thermonuclear war, which I thought was the most wonderful understatement I've ever heard in my life.
House of Lords,
But the nuclear clock has steadily moved towards midnight.
Exactly, yes.
And we have not done enough to try and make it go backwards. We haven't done the right agreements with Russia, tried to down things down.
And we have this feeling, don't we, sometimes, that because we're more modern than, say, the moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we sort of think, well, surely that could never happen again. Whereas history demonstrates things can always happen again. And they were no more likely to think it was going to happen when the Cuban Missile Strike was just about to happen than we are now. So
we never thought inflation could happen again, did we? But not quite on the same scale.
Some of us assumed that it might. Can I just very quickly come back on this point around sanctions? Because there have been sanctions obviously in place with regards to Russia
for a while,
since 2014,
yes,
since
but
the
not
invasion of Crimea. Not heavy sanctions, but what they did show, and they did inflict some pain on the Russian economy, particularly because at that point Putin hadn't had the chance to accumulate significant international reserves, which he now does have, which gives him some more leeway. And of course he's used that period since the invasion of Crimea to build up those reserves in order basically to allow him to have more wiggle room when he was planning to to step up this invasion, which he's really arguably been planning to do since the Minsk II agreements.
Well, he said, I've been in the intelligence world, apart from when I've been at sea and ships, for 6 years. I was head of naval intelligence 3 years. I was head of all of defence intelligence 3 years. And all of us in the intelligence world, if you want to know what Putin thinks, just watch his lips. He says it. And he said very clearly what he intended to do. He said it absolutely clearly.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I now feel completely inadequate to make any comment on this subject at all after what Alan's just said about what he was doing for 6 years. But before we just go to a break, Alan, I want you to relate an anecdote from your diaries where you were in the room with Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary, when the Russian ambassador came in after the Skripal poisonings. Just tell us what happened.
We've got Alan 1 and Alan 2 here. I'll agree to be the junior Alan. I was Boris's deputy when we had the Novichok poisoning in Salisbury, and I have to say, despite all my occasional ups and downs with Boris Johnson, I thought this was him at his very, very best. When he summoned the Russian ambassador, who came in all jauntily, with his sort of KGB, FSB sidekick, and sort of smiling, and was not allowed to sit down. We were on the opposite side of the big table in the Foreign Secretary's office. It was me, Boris, and Philip Barton. Sir Philip is now the Permanent Secretary, and Boris was just masterly. He absolutely addressed the ambassador with the agreed script, and worked up to quite a finale of real, genuine and well-expressed indignation. And out the ambassador went, not having said a word, with his tail between his legs. Message very firmly delivered. Now, these, sort of dressings down of an ambassador only go so far, but it left him in no doubt. And he did it very well. And I have to say, I think the Prime Minister is rising very well to this serious global threat and conflict. And, I'm glad he's there and not Jeremy Corbyn or someone like that. I have to say, I think Ben Wallace is doing a very good job as Defence Secretary too. Well, so I think that, I'm glad they're there.
We've got a question along those lines, which you might come to in a minute as well. Thank you all for your answers so far. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
20 past 8 on LBC. Admiral Lord West is here. So Alan Duncan, Jude Kelly and Grace Blakeley answering your questions. Let's go to Harry in Bristol. Harry, hello.
Good evening.
Evening. What would you like to ask?
I just wanted to ask why it's appeared that so many Western leaders have appeared to need public outrage to reach a sensible position on Ukraine.
Alan West.
Well, that's in a way, that's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it? I mean, I think what is interesting is over a number of years, we have allowed Putin and Russia to get away with things. And, for example, and we've given him the wrong messages. So, for example, since 2010, when the coalition did that immense cut of a third of our military, people like Putin and others looked at that and said, they're not really interested in defence. They looked at Europe and thought, they're not really interested in defence because the spending went down and down. Our reactions to things that were done by them were not... I mean, the attack in Salisbury, an attack on our soil with weapons of mass destruction, that is just quite unbelievable, really. And I know we took actions at the time, and I think it was great that we got other countries to come behind us. But then, before that, there'd been the polonium poisoning of Litvinenko, and so I think there were a whole series of things which made Putin start thinking, those people aren't willing to stand up and fight. And then when you had Afghanistan, he must have been rubbing his hands with glee. There were other things going on, and we didn't really start pulling together, I think, as a coordinated group. Even at the beginning of this crisis, we were getting different responses from America, ourselves, and Europe, and the countries within Europe.
So do you think he's been surprised at how united the international community... Well, I say the international community, but predominantly Europe and America.
Because now it is much more coordinated, focused. There's a real response. I mean, it's actually... He's done wonders for NATO. He's done wonders for us to pull us together. And I think that surprises.
And what do you make of the Chinese response to this? Because it hasn't been what I was necessarily expecting.
I think it's fascinating. The Chinese, although they're the great long-term worry in a way, they are also very, very sensible and they think long-term. The fact that they actually abstained from the vote in the UN was, I thought, great. I was actually shocked by India's abstention, I have to say.
And the UAE.
I thought that was appalling, and UAE, but India abstaining was awful. But the fact the Chinese abstained, and when you look at some of their comments recently, they're not happy with what Putin's doing, even though they had that chat. They're not happy. And I think that is very interesting. But in answer to the question, I think we allowed him to get away with too much, and now things are all coming together. And I think that's part of the problem where, as I say, I do believe now he is slightly unbalanced because he is just seeing he's very remote. He's so worried about COVID. He sends someone around a corner where he's walking around in his palace to make sure there's no one there before he goes round because of COVID. His staff are way away. He's getting no sensible advice. And that is really worrying.
Can I say, I think there's one point, Alan, that you didn't mention, which I think perhaps the questioner had in mind, which is our response to Crimea. And I think probably we are all guilty of reacting weakly to the annexation of Crimea, thinking that was just that little bit at the bottom of, nearly Russia and the edge of Ukraine. But the thing about this guy is give him an inch and he'll take a mile, and he's now trying to take the mile. And the Donbass has been simmering away for 8 years, where I think we have been awake to it in the same way as we have on Georgia and places where the Russians try to encroach. But I think Crimea, if we look back at it, was a mistake of foreign policy on the part of the West not to react more firmly and perhaps to have had the sanctions much more toughly then.
Just a second, Grace. The United Arab Emirates abstaining in that UN resolution. I mean, you're a bit of a Middle East expert. So you can't explain it.
Well, I think it is for them to explain because I don't understand their motivation unless it's just wanting a lot of money in the UAE, be it Dubai or Abu Dhabi, or that they might argue they wanted to keep their lines of communication open so that they could be a broker or something. But it doesn't look very convincing without a cogent explanation coming from them.
There's another explanation for abstention by the UAE and also the long-term failure of our government to take any action, which is just the astonishing influence of Russian money all over the world. I mentioned that point about the oligarchs who surround Putin and their astonishing, huge huge wealth that is greater than the rest of the population combined. Most of that is held abroad because these people don't trust each other, they don't trust Putin, they hold this money abroad. A huge amount of that money ends up in London property, a huge amount of that money ends up in our politics.
Yeah, but are they all
directly
bad? And
to
how do you know who are the goodies and who are the baddies?
What do you mean, how do you know?
Well,
They're Russian oligarchs
so
surrounding
they're all
Putin.
bad.
We shouldn't be allowing their money into
you
London
are
either
saying
way.
it's not as simple as that. I think you're
absolutely
oversimplifying.
We should not be allowing any money that we cannot identify into the London property market through our banking system, and certainly not through secrecy jurisdictions, because it could come from anywhere. It could come from oligarchs or warlords all over the world.
There are very rich Russians who have come here in the last 20 years who are bitter opponents of Vladimir Putin, but you can't just brand them all the same.
Of course you can't, but we need to know where what I was saying was that there is a huge amount of Russian money that has been sunk into London property, often via shell corporations registered in tax havens. We don't know who owns them. We don't know where the money comes from. A lot of it comes from Russian oligarchs close to Putin. Some of it comes from warlords, arms dealers, all sorts of unscrupulous characters from all over the world. And we don't go after them because a lot of that money ends up in the pockets of our politicians.
I'm the Lord's member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, the ISC, and we produced a report on Russia, and that report took ages to actually come out. And we lay down in there quite clearly the real problems you're identifying, real problems about Russian money going into all sorts of areas in the UK. I'm afraid some of it amongst politicians. And that has really got to be properly exposed and done, because we've put the report in, and a lot of the things we suggested have not been implemented, and we need to do that.
I think the point Grace was making is that the law could be changed to make sure that we can identify where these properties are funded from. And if you can't identify it, then they're sequestered.
One of the foremost experts in Russian money laundering in the UK is Oliver Bullock, and he says that the laws that we need to identify these people are already in place. The difficulty is that the National Crime Agency and the Serious Fraud Office don't have the resources that they need to actually follow these prosecutions through, or even follow the investigations through. And that came through in the 2018 report where it said...
they will very soon.
Well, let's hope so.
But you're right, they probably should have done... Jude, you've been gagging to get in.
I was thinking that I agree that we haven't looked tough in all kinds of ways, and I'm thinking that partly this goes back to the end of history moment. I mean, I do think that from when the wall fell, there was kind of a sense that the West wished itself into a place where all that was over, and it wanted to stay in that mindset because that's what we would like it to be like. And I remember working with the writer, Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian writer, who was a wanted man for years under Abacha. And he said one of the problems about liberals is that they don't understand the mindset of people who are not like them. They don't understand the mindset of tyrants because they're not one. And so they always underestimate the single-minded ruthlessness of their opponent because they would like them not to be like that. And I think that Alan 1, are we calling you?
Alan Senior, top Alan.
Big dog Alan, little dog Alan.
Is right in saying that, in a sense, we sort of drifted away from being tough because we were distracted, we didn't want to spend the money, and also we're trying to view ourselves as nations that don't do that any longer. And we're demilitarising, and in a way, of course, that's what I would like. But when you're faced with Russia, who does not want to think that way and prides themselves on their military campaigns. And look, you've only got to look how we celebrate May Day. We chuck petals about and, theoretically dance around maypoles, and they all go marching around showing what weapons they've got. And it just says we can't be naive.
There's also the point here that's worth bearing in mind about the just utter stagnation of the Ukrainian economy since the 1990s. The average Ukrainian is barely any better off in real terms than they were at the fall of the Soviet Union, and that has exacerbated and consolidated the divisions within Ukrainian society and, given Russia a lot of the kind of ammo that it needs to sow division and dissent. And when Ukraine has approached international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank for support, it has found itself being forced through the same sort of austerity measures that we've seen.
Well, the corruption there has been appalling.
And there is also the corruption of its political elite as well, which, again, we have done very little to tackle. So there's some really complicated issues here. And I don't think that anyone, as yet, in our political debate has demonstrated an adequate grasp of those interconnected issues.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion so far. We have 30 minutes to go. Keep your calls coming. 0345 6060 973. Let's get the latest news headlines on LBC at 8:30 with Andy Ivey.
The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights says there have been 406 civilian casualties in Ukraine since the Russian invasion, with at least 102 dead. But a spokesman says the figure could be considerably higher, and more than 500,000 refugees have left the country. The Home Secretary says an additional 100,000 Ukrainians will be able to seek sanctuary in the UK, but Labour has demanded clarification, saying those trying to flee to Britain have been left in utter confusion. In an extension of sanctions, all UK ports are being asked to deny access to Russian-flagged, registered or operated vessels. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, says Britain will keep ratcheting up its response to Russia, and she's announced Belarus will face further measures for what she calls its complicity in the invasion of Ukraine. LBC weather tonight: a widespread frost under clear skies. Tomorrow, cloudy across southern England with some rain and drizzle. Moving northwards later, plenty of sunshine elsewhere. A high of 9 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:34 on LBC. Admiral Lord West is with us, Alan Duncan, Grace Blakeley and Jude Kelly. Now, Jude, I want you to tell us briefly about the WOW Foundation and this Women of the World Festival that you organise.
OK, well, I was artistic director of the South Bank Centre in London for 12 years, and during that time, although it was one of the largest...
the ultimate lovey job, that, isn't it?
It is the ultimate lovely job. And actually, do you know, I have to say that this is one of the motivations for me starting the WOW festivals, because, you know, for people who can't see me, but I'm a small Liverpudlian woman and, you know, not Oxbridge, not a man, and I got a job that really would never have been available to someone like me, say, 25 years ago. And that's the direct result of fantastic education, birth control, opportunities, etc., etc. But, we are not in a world where girls and women are equal yet. We're definitely not there, any part of the world. And so I wanted to celebrate everything that girls and women are doing and could do, all the potential that's available. So I started these festivals actually to celebrate 100th anniversary of Women's Day. That was 12 years ago now. And then they just started building, and now we've done 150 festivals around the world. There are 17 different countries, including actually an invitation to put one in Russia, which I haven't been able to take it up yet. And it's very exciting because really it's a celebration. Not a complaint, a celebration of the amazing things that girls and women do, everything from astronauts running up the Navy, the whole lot. But being candid about the fact that because you have got thousands of years of inequality, catching up isn't simple. And there's such a lot to do. And you need to have these conversations about medicine, about law, about community activism, about military combat, about absolutely everything, and realise how they're all connected. So obviously, it's International Women's Day next week, and it's going to be a fantastic opportunity for people all over the world to go, OK, what next? What shall we do? How shall we have, more women running newspapers, more women running governments? And what would it look like if the world was equal? Which is something that most people can't imagine, They can't actually have it in their heads what that would look like. They know it would be nice to have more progress, but they don't imagine completely different level of equality.
We booked you on the wrong week, didn't we? We should have had you next week.
Been having next week as well. I'm very available.
You never get too much due. Now, just a brief interjection here. AFP are reporting that Turkey has blocked military ships from the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Alan West, your reaction to that?
I mean, they've blocked all military ships going either way, have they?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they have control over the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, and there is a treaty that, for example, doesn't allow aircraft carriers through. You have to give notice if a submarine is going through. I think it's interesting. It's very interesting what Erdogan's position is on all of this.
It's because he's been
his relationship with Russia his relationship with Russia is quite a. They took an air defense system which he bought from the Russians, which meant the Americans then didn't sell him the F-35s because they give you all the data about their security in terms of IFF and things like that. So that caused problems. There's been the whole issue within northern Syria where there have been clashes and the so.
Well, that's interesting because Oz Chatterjee, who we've been hearing a lot from on this station over the past few days, he's in Kiev. He's just tweeted that Russia's main Syria supply route is now cut off. This war could have much wider geopolitical implications.
Interesting. Because if you stopped any military ships going through, then Russian ships won't be able to go through to Tartus, which is the main base for the Russians in Syria, and one of the reasons that they supported Assad. It's fascinating. I think one needs to know more of the detail of exactly what it is.
Is there an implication here this could have an impact on what's going on in Syria then?
Absolutely could. If there's no...
Yes.
Right, let's go to our next question. It's David in Enfield. David, hi, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. Hope you're all well.
We are
since
indeed.
2006, Putin and his agents have murdered 12 British citizens. You referred to Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, poisoned in London. There were then the 10 British citizens killed in the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over eastern Ukraine by Russian separatists in 2014. Then we had the unfortunate death of Dawn Sturgis as a result of the Skripal poisoning in 2016. Now, despite these atrocities, the US government has issued over 2,500 golden visas to rich Russian citizens in recent years, some of whom are contributing...
Do you mean the UK? You said US, but I think you mean UK, don't you?
Sorry?
Do you mean UK government? You said US.
Sorry, the UK government, yes. Has issued over 2,500 golden visas to rich Russian citizens, some of whom are funding political parties and individual MPs. Does the panel think this was a good idea?
Jude Kelly.
Well, this is picking up on what Grace has been literally banging on about on the table. And I think that you're right. First of all, let's not put all Russians in the same category. Let's not put anybody all in one lump. There are great Russians in Britain, who are neutral and positive, doing things for the good. There always are, aren't there, in any nation. But nevertheless, there are also people who have been allowed to come here, money launder, keep political associations in a very toxic way, and we haven't done anything about it. We haven't done enough about it. And I think that's quite frightening.
Do you think?
Well, I think because the network of power isn't just at government level, is it? It's all sorts of power frameworks that are to do with rich on rich, business associates, deals, etc. And I think those are very, very difficult networks to break because governments end up being reliant on them. They need their good favour, and people are always sort of calling in favours from people who have dodgy backgrounds. I mean, I remember going to a few dinner parties in my time thinking the people around this table, this is a mixture of the great and the good and the bad and the awful. And they're all part of London society together.
Which one did you fit in?
I was probably just awful, but certainly not powerful. and it made me worry because it made me think about Nazi Germany, where people sort of knew each other's colours really politically, but it suited each other to kind of down at the same table. Now, I'm not saying that this is about Nazi Germany. That's not the point I'm making. But simply that people turn blind eyes to an awful lot of things because they have gain that they can get for their own causes. And I think we haven't been ethical enough.
Grace?
Yeah, I agree. Surprisingly enough, no, we have granted a huge number. These golden visas are a pretty horrendous innovation in any case. Most of them, the majority go to Chinese nationals. The second largest group is Russian nationals. They've levelled off now over the last few years as the government's actually started imposing some controls and restrictions on the ability of Russians who have money from suspicious origins coming into the UK. But again, not nearly enough.
Well, they've abolished them now, haven't they?
Yeah, well, now they have, yeah. So the number reduced and then they were abolished. And we've had all sorts of measures that have been introduced in an attempt largely since Crimea to try and clamp down on some of this money, and those stepped up in 2018. We had the unusual wealth orders, the UWOs, I think, but only 4 of them have been issued and only 1's been followed through, so they've not been particularly useful. Johnson has talked about setting up this kleptocracy office. We already have the International Corruption Unit. That hasn't been doing very much. And I think, again, as you were mentioning, there's clearly these links with politics. The Conservatives have received millions of pounds in donations from Russian-linked sources. But there's also, I think, a very interesting point here about the impact of Russian money on the London property market, particularly in specific places. In places like Kensington and Chelsea, you have at least 6,000 homes that can be linked to Russian money. And it pushes up house prices. So it actually benefits some people who own property in those areas.
Alan?
Yeah, look, I think there's a very interesting sort of subliminal question behind the question that's just been put, which is, what is our foreign policy? It's supposed to believe in what we call the sort of rules-based international order. And those rules that you follow international law, that you don't annex another country, that you respect sovereignty, things like that. And it's absolutely clear that in the case of Ukraine, those rules have been totally violated. But our own credibility only holds together if we're consistent in the way that we apply this principle. So, for instance, and this is something which links the two, do we turn a blind eye to the fact that Abramovich is reported to have given £100 million to settler causes in Israel, which is an illegal breach of the rules-based international order?
I feel I should be putting the word allegedly in here.
I said is reported.
Right,
to
okay.
Yeah, I chose my words carefully.
He has form on.
Yeah, no, I chose my words carefully. He's reported to have. Now, if it's not true, it's not true. However, a lot of American money undoubtedly does go into a similar such cause. Now, you can't sort of say that it's wrong to challenge the sovereignty of Ukraine against international law if you're not also holding a similar view when a similar sort of thing is happening elsewhere. and the annexation of the West Bank, albeit gradually and not in the same totally violent way, but on the ground it is horribly violent, is a long, simmering, continuing such example. So
you do realise you've
balanced.
just set Twitter off by saying that.
I've no doubt, and I hope the parallel is drawn because it deserves to be. However, we must focus primarily on Ukraine because that's where the intense threat is at the moment.
Alan West.
I mean, I think the golden visa thing is dreadful and they should be got rid of. I mean, it's just appalling, actually.
Well, they have abolished them now.
I mean, they're just awful. I don't know how we got that. So it's fascinating, isn't it? We have a Russian peer, of course. He wasn't there for either of the debates on Ukraine, which I found quite interesting. I'm afraid we've done a lot of very silly things both with Russia and with China, actually. And we're slightly reaping the whirlwind. We're reaping the whirlwind quicker with Russia at the moment, but long term we'll reach all sorts of things with China. You look at our best courses at university on AI, where we lead the world in a lot of areas, and 90% of the people on those courses at Manchester were Chinese. And of those 90%, 60% of them were actually PLA, People's Liberation Army. We've lost the plot, and we've got to bloody well sort of...
Universities.
Excuse my language, we've got to sort ourselves out.
There are plenty of universities in this country that would not exist today without Chinese students, aren't there?
I think that's true. I don't know the detail.
But, I mean, you were making an oblique reference there to Evgeny Lebedev, the owner of the Evening Standard.
Yes.
Now, he is rumoured to have links to Putin. Boris Johnson went to stay at his villa in Italy, I think, straight after the Skripal, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, nobody's talking about him.
This is what I mean about how I think we've lost the plot. I mean, this is just not... This is bad behaviour. This is not the thing to do, and we're reaping the whirlwind.
And that's what I meant about dinner parties, really, which is that people go, but, they're really nice and they give this money to this for charity, and I know them, and my best friend, and he comes to see my plays, and all this sort of stuff. And it's all kind of a camouflage over just getting to the very bottom of the fact that, yes, as Alan says, what are the actual belief systems that people are living by? And if they're not living by them, why are we not calling it out?
Right, on that bombshell, we will move on. It's 8:46.
LBC.
Good evening and welcome. This is Andrew Marr.
Tonight with Andrew Marr on LBC.
I was looking for a place where I could speak frankly. That's LBC. I was looking for somewhere that is fast-moving, exciting, fresh. That's LBC.
Tonight with Andrew Marr.
This is a new kind of show. I want to call things out. If someone is lying, I want to say that they're lying.
Starts Monday the 7th of March.
6 p.m. is more or less the perfect time. LBC is now the only place to go.
Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Starts Monday the 7th of March from 6 p.m. Listen on your radio and watch on Global Player.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 10 to 9 on LBC. Alan West, Jude Kelly, Grace Blakeley and Alan Duncan with me answering your questions. Jess is in Sheffield. She sent in a text saying, isn't it a bit rich for the government to criticise Putin's attack on democracy while making it more difficult to protest? Grace.
I don't think there are going to be any surprises as to my response on this. No, I mean, I think this is what I was alluding to at the start of this show when I said that there has been a trend all over the world, particularly since the financial crisis, towards this kind of quite ruthless and authoritarian style of leadership. And that has been the case in the Western world, and it's been the case in much of the rest of the world as well. And here in the UK, over the last few years, we have seen something of an authoritarian slide amongst this government, and it is very worrying. So the policing bill, for example, does include some pretty rigorous stipulations on the things that you have to fulfill in order to undertake a legitimate protest. It allows protests to be shut down if people make a noise complaint. It really has been criticised by lots of human rights organisations all around the world as effectively criminalising protest. You take that alongside the Overseas Operations Bill, alongside things like what happened when, I remember being in Clapham when we were protesting the killing of Sarah Everard, and the astonishing response to that. I think I came on the show not long after that as well. There is a climate of authoritarianism, I think, that is growing here. It's growing throughout Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, in the US, in a lot of parts of the world, in the Philippines, in Brazil, and it is concerning, and it is being driven by egoic, maniacal men, basically.
Talking of which, Alan West.
That's rather harsh, isn't it? That's rather harsh. I have to say, I did actually vote against that police crime in the Lords, as many of us did. In fact, we had more votes that night than because I think they had gone.
Joking, I hope.
I think they had gone too far. I mean, I think they'd gone too far. One of the great things in this country is that you can demonstrate. Now, there might be. I mean, people did get fed up with people super gluing themselves all over areas where people won't want to go to, and they had people being interviewed, didn't they? I was trying to go to hospital. But you mustn't do a knee-jerk about that sort of thing. You've got to just take a deep breath and say, that is not the way we behave in this country. We don't stop them. These are the things that are a right for us in this country, and we've got to be really, really careful. It sounds all very neat and ordered to stop them and cancel them. I think, for example, around Parliament, I think it's absolutely appropriate. There should be an ability of the police to allow people to get into Parliament. You can't allow demonstrators to stop Parliament functioning. But you can do that without the blanket things they were talking about. And I think that is worrying. And I think, absolutely right, I do believe, actually, we have got more authoritarian. If you look at some of the things from the Home Office, it is actually quite worrying. When I was in the Home Office, there were things that I didn't like. I got into terrible trouble on the business of, if you remember, 48 days being banged up before you had to charge them. Well, my mistake was I wanted to see the evidence to prove that I needed that. So I appeared on the Today programme and said, I'm not convinced. Well, sadly, that wasn't the government's line. I didn't realise that. I wasn't a politician. I didn't know that if you're in the government, there's a line you're meant to follow.
How refreshing.
So that was a bit silly. But, I mean, even then they were trying to do these things, which is not good.
Jack Boots, Jackie Smith, my partner in crime on the For the Many podcast, she was the one that introduced these golden visas, I think, as well. Jude?
Yeah, I think we have gone much too far, and I think it's good that this particular bill is being debated again at this particular point with Ukraine, because it calls into focus the idea that people are entitled to and have to fight and speak out about their rights. And, I remember in the 80s and 90s, people were really sort of fed up with the fact that young people and students and so on didn't seem to have any political views any longer. There's a lot of kind of concern that people weren't active citizens. Well, they're not concerned now. They're cross, because we have a lot of active citizens who do have views on everything from climate change to wars. And that's what democracy should be. It should be about voting people in to represent you on major issues. But there's all kinds of things that have to happen in a 4-year term that require the public to be able to say, that's not good enough, that won't happen, we need to change this. So I'm very worried. I think if there is a kind of authoritarianism, a big man, hard man kind of idea, that is worrying. It's almost like, I mean, that idea of the touchy-feely, let's put an end to that touchy-feely thing. It's weird. There's a kind of dichotomy going on, because on the one hand, people are beginning to really enjoy collaborative leadership, consensual leadership, less macho ideas. And at the same time, it feels as if people are pressing down very hard against society, having a multitude of views.
Some youngsters are pretty
talking
ghastly.
Talking of macho ideas.
Macho ideas.
Right, Alan.
From what I can see, it does feel as though this legislation is sort of clamping down on protests too much. I mean, there always has to be a line between, permanent blockades and things like that, which might need to be broken up. But, I mean, I think there's a simple solution to this, and that's that Parliament does its job. And for far too long, I think that parliamentarians have forgotten their main purpose, which is to legislate well. They're too busy tweeting and sounding off and mouthing off, and they're not looking at the detail of legislation. And whereas the Lords are far better at doing this than the Commons, I think, is not looking properly at legislation. So if the executive is, and it's probably no surprise with the Home Secretary we have, wants to clamp down...
Not a fan?
Not a great fan, is clamping down on protests like this, then the House of Commons should say, hold on, that's the executive going too far. Here are the principles which should govern legitimate protest, and these are the barriers over which you must not step. And I don't think the Commons is doing this enough. They're too busy sounding off, mouthing off, rather than legislating. And it's high time that MPs realise their first job is to legislate well.
I went to Jack Dromey's funeral the other day in Westminster, and he was such a great activist as a trade unionist, and then he was a great MP for Birmingham, and everybody was there. All the whole of the political elite were there, cross-party, all admiring him for what he was, which was a great backbencher and then a great supporter of many issues. And I watched Hilary Benn, munching his way through a pork pie, and we had a bit of a chat. And again, I was reminded of how great it is when individuals like him stand up and call the House of Commons to account and say, this is our job to hold the executive, to account. And I think it's true, Alan, that it has to be the Commons has to fight back stronger against this trend.
Right, we have a final question. It's from James in Hitchin. James, hi, go ahead.
Good evening. How would the panel characterise the leadership and conduct of Volodymyr Zelensky?
Jude.
Well, it's funny enough. Last night I was watching The Muppets with Ricky Gervais with my son and my granddaughter. Okay. And I was imagining what would have happened if Ricky Gervais had become the Prime Minister, because in a sense that's the situation. You've got a comedian who imitated being a president and then he got voted in. I think he's doing a marvellous job representing how the Ukrainian people feel. I mean, he might have been somebody that Putin thought was a kind of a weak link because he obviously is, in some respects, politically naive. But he's standing up for his people in a very upfront way, and I think that they obviously love him and they're inspired by him. I fear so much that the Ukrainian people are going to walk straight into their own deaths by fighting back. But on the other hand, I'd probably do the same, and I'd let him lead me because he seems to be standing at the front of. He could have got out, couldn't he? The US offered him safe passage, and he said, "Actually, I need arms, not a free trip."
Yeah, Alan.
I see no naivety in the man. I see enormous courage, very good judgment in the tone he adopts in rallying his own people. And I give him, 1 million out of 10. I think he's admirable. And I think that cometh the man, cometh the hour. Mm-hmm. I think the country is very lucky to have him.
Grace?
I think that pretty much every Ukrainian leader over the last several decades has been caught in the same position. It's largely an escapable position. They are caught between a rock and a hard place between Russia and the EU. And we, the EU, have not made that position much better because we have failed to provide the kind of aid and support and economic support to the people of Ukraine that would provide the foundations for a genuine recovery and a genuine long-term resolution to this crisis, which has meant that since before 2015, this these divisions have been rumbling on, and I think Zelensky is doing as best he can, just as previous leaders have, of juggling this impossible divide that exists within this country and that is not going to get better until Ukraine sees long-term stable economic development.
Okay.
I think he's showing himself to be amazingly impressive, far more impressive than I thought he would, and he's stood up to the challenge that has faced him, and I think he's coming over well. He's not corrupt, which is unusual for the leaders in that area of the world. Certainly doesn't seem to be. We haven't found any corruption involved, and I think he will be one of the heroes that comes out of it. Sadly, I think, because finally Russia will take over the Ukraine, I have no doubt about that, he might well be killed. And I think he was very wise not to go to Minsk, because Belarus is a dreadful place, and if he'd gone there, we might well have found he'd disappeared. And he was very sensible, arranging to have a meeting.
We must make sure we don't have short memories. This is going to go on a long time, and we mustn't just let the news focus turn and then we forget.
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
Got to have long memory. I never forget this one.
My worry is that as Russia is finding it's difficult, so we've just seen that big attack on a block of flats and things. They're going to use more and more power, Putin's team, thermobaric weapons and things. I'm afraid the casualty rate will get higher and higher. That's the worry.
Do you know, Zelensky tonight downloaded a form and he filled it in saying, we'd like to join the EU, and he posted it. And I thought that's the act of, not a politician who's been around for years, but a kind of creative person, which is what he is. And, good on him.
There's a meme going around Twitter, which I've put on my Twitter feed this evening. Things on Earth you can see from space. They've got a picture of the Great Pyramids, the Amazon River, the Grand Canyon, the bulls of Vladimir Zelensky. It's true, isn't it?
Yeah.
Final tweet here from Laura, who says, I really love Cross Question. Such interesting guests and varied opinions, but always polite and civilised. Well, I kind of wish this could go on for the next hour, but you've all got homes to go to, so I guess we'd better let you go. Alan West, Jude Kelly, Grace Blakeley and Alan Duncan, thank you very much for joining us. If you missed any of the programme or want to catch up, you can do so on Global Player in about probably an hour's time, and also on our YouTube channel and Global Player. Right, we are going to turn our attention to what we should do about Ukrainians who want to seek asylum in this country. The government have made an announcement today. Does it go far enough? 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 3 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, more blasts have been heard in Kyiv on the fifth day of the Russian invasion. Air raid sirens are sounding again in the Ukrainian capital, with